All right. So it is my it is my it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bill Andrews from Georgia Tech, who was so kind, so nice to drive here for 5 hours to give us a talk in person. So she's right now a associate professor in the School of City and Regional Planning, and also in the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech. Computing, sorry. I'm creating research now. So she directs the Friendly Cities Lab at Georgia Tech, where they do a lot of mathematical modeling and analysis of social networks, spatial networks, and also trying to consolidate social and spatial networks into SSN, social spatial networks framework. Before her current position, she was assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Penn State. So she's a geographer, I think. All right, so I think in 2021, she was awarded the most prestigious NSF award for junior faculty, which is the NSF Career Award. And that's how I get to know her. I think it's about social and spatial network. So today's her talk will be centered around that funded project and her previous and current research projects. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Clill Andrews.
Thank you so much for having me today. Thanks for Yuji for that really nice introduction. And I will say we have a grant advisory committee member here, so thanks for that. I really jumped at the chance at visiting you today. I wanted to be here, and I'm so grateful that you let me come here in person. This department has such a worldwide reputation, and also such a strong reputation for spatial network analysis. And so thank you very much for having me. Today I'm going to talk about my research on spatial social network analysis, which we abbreviate as SSN, but apparently most people think of that as social security number. Today, just spatial social network analysis, new approaches, and some new tools. So I'll talk a little bit about how we analyze geospatial networks. I do go over some literature here about spatial social network stories. That is the kind of a literature review, but I like sharing these stories. Talk about some new research examples. One is based on the Mafia, and the other one that we're still working on right now is based on a food sharing network in Blacksburg, Virginia. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to create some community around this topic, and then conclude. So usually when we analyze networks geospatially, we're usually talking about like something like road networks. So here is one of our geography favorites. This is John Snow's cholera map, and from the 1800s. And this is where the pumps are. This is where the cases were. And then this is a very cool diagram because it is showing on the road network or the path network what the closest pump was. And that's a cool thing to show instead of just Euclidean distance, because we can see that. So here's an example of geospatial analysis of networks. Here's another great example of geospatial analysis of networks when they're non-planar. So this is brand new mapping software that's out called flowmapper.org from geographers at University of Iowa. And they're working on visualization, but we as geographers like to know where things flow. So for instance, here's an example of banana trade between countries. And then this is an example of migration from kinship migration around the turn of the century, and then a little bit after the turn of the century. And I highly recommend this for visualization. But what about small social networks? What about these little stories? This is an example of one of the first sociograms. This is by Jacob Moreno, who published this in 1934, but presented it at a medical conference in 1933. This is of a first grade class, and it actually is spatial, so he went to look at the first grade class. And the boys are shown here as triangles, the girls are shown here as circles, this is where they were sitting, and this is who interacted with whom. And we can see here that there's a bit of what we call a homophily effect emerging, meaning that the boys were sitting with boys, the girls were sitting with the girls, and there wasn't too much interaction between there. But we also see that there's a few emerging nodes here that a lot of people interacted with, and we call these high degree nodes. So this is an example of one of the first recorded times that we had, that we were able to see links and nodes. And how are social networks guided by geography? So that is a big question of mine, and I very much enjoy taking a look at that. So maybe this is a social network of yours. Maybe this is a social network of mine. And the nodes are people that we know, and the links between them are who is connected to whom. So maybe you have friends who are on a softball team with you. Maybe you have friends from a religious institution. Maybe you're taking a night class somewhere. Maybe these are friends you work with. Maybe these are family members. Here's your brother, here's your aunt, uncle. There should be a tie between those probably. But a lot of these parts of your social network, they need geographic space, and they're reinforced by geographic space. You need a softball field to have a softball team. We do a lot of things virtually, but before you may be attending these things in person, and you need the built environment to be able to do that. So how does geography affect social networks, and how do social networks affect geography? So the goal of my research agenda is to provide tools, methods, and measurements for small spatial social networks. And in my heart, I'm a GIS person, so I gravitate a little bit more towards the GIS. So I want to be able to answer the most basic research questions about spatial social networks. One example of those is, how do mountains affect friendship? How does a new train affect dating? Something like that. Provide tools to tell better stories and test hypotheses, and make it easy for people to map and explore their spatial social networks. So I like to bring in, we all know that geography has a lot of applications across the campus: engineering, anthropology, sociology. One of my goals is to bring in people from many different disciplines to be able to use GIS tools to help answer their questions. So now I'll go over a couple of spatial social network stories. I will just preface this by saying I'm telling you what I know about these, and at the end, I don't have a lot more knowledge about it because it's my literature review. This is one of my favorite spatial social network papers ever. You know that paper where you find it and you just jump out of your seat and you're like, this is wonderful. So this is by Catherine Fouts, who does social network research for many, many years at North Carolina. And this one is called The Spatial Arrangement of Social and Economic Network of Villages in the Nanrong District of Thailand. So they had a very long temporal project in Thailand. This example is the location of villages that they were studying, and the linkages between them are arrows that points to towns that hire tractors and towns providing tractors. And normally, if you were just doing a social network analysis, you might just have, again, that sociogram that's floating around in feature space. But what they decided to do, and this was in the year 2000, this was published, was use 1993 Landsat data, which differentiated the rice, the upland agriculture, forest, water, and then other type of classification to see what was driving the different tractor sharing. And they found a correlation between the land cover and the tractor sharing, in that villages with greater amounts of land in the upland agriculture, which had sugar and cassava, were more likely to both send and receive tractors. Villages with greater amounts of land in the rice growing areas were a lot less likely to send and receive tractors. And because this was a very economic, social kind of relationship that got people to talk and got people to share, the land cover, the Landsat data and the land cover was a really important thing to include here. Here's another example: rural social networks along Amazonian rivers, seeds, labors, and soccer among communities on the Napa River in Peru. So here the nodes are also rural villages. The edges are seed sharing, cooperative labor, and soccer tournaments. Yep. And so this is just, again, these are just space filling. They're not geographic right now, but the different nodes show the different villages and then whether they have a connection. So you can see that the cooperative labor, it doesn't make for a complete connected network. For the seed sharing, there is definitely a long chain here. And for the soccer, this is a very well-connected network that's very well reinforced. And the communities here are in different regions. So here it is on a map. We all know what software this was made in. That looks familiar. There's our ArcMap. Okay, so these are soccer languages with the most important soccer partner. And we can see by overlaying the river here and seeing where the villages are on the river and seeing where these connections are, what the dynamics are in geographic space. So on average, the soccer linkages are only about 3 kilometers apart, but the highest soccer linkages, there's a number of them that are above 40 kilometers, and there's one that's up to 79 kilometers. So they will travel to play soccer. On the other hand, the cooperative labor network is a little bit more localized, and it's not as well connected. So we do see that the cooperative labor does tend to go right on the water here, and it then tends to have some sort of rates in these different locations. So mapping these networks is helping us better understand the exchanges between these villages and how the geography associates with that. Here's another example. This is called Spatial Social Network Analysis of Resource Access in Rural South Africa. And on this example, the nodes are households and the edges are different exchanges. So these are exchanges of wood and water. So these are wood resource access that they're sharing wood between the households. And then the blue are water and wood exchange between the households. And then when you map this when you overlay this on top of an aerial image, and you get to see a little bit more of the background here. We have a labor exchange, we have money exchange, food exchange, wood and water exchange, and then diverse info exchange. And what this map is showing just at first glance, there's statistics behind it, but it's that the distance in crossing over this field and crossing over this area is not a barrier to interaction. So instead of one hypothesis we might have is that the only interactions would remain localized, and this would be a big friction force for interacting. But even just looking at it, we can better understand that this isn't a huge barrier for interaction. Hello. This is my new favorite one. I won't say too much about it, but this is like gold standard here, spatial social network analysis of the 9/11 terrorist network coordination. I won't embarrass myself by going too much into it, but this analysis shows coordination network of the 9/11 perpetrators, terrorists who trained together, lived together, shared money, and boarded the same flight. It also describes the cities where members traveled together, such as Atlanta, Boston, and New York. And just showing the networks between the individuals, and then this wonderful graph here to show who was associated with who and for how many numbers of days gives us a really, really rich example of this network and how geographic space plays a role. Okay, this is my last example. I'm showing you this. I don't usually show this one, but hey, we're in a college town, right? I lived in a college town for a very long time. This journal article here with my former graduate student Solha. It's called Romantic Relationships in the Built Environment, a case study of a US college town. So we interviewed couples, or we surveyed couples, and when we have a dot here, it means that that's one person from a couple, and then we have another dot, it's another person from a couple. We don't disclose the year that we did this, but it was a while ago. And then we have cohabitating couples have like a little bit of a circle and a double circle around them. And from this analysis, in the colors here is the number of downtown places they like to hang out at. From this analysis, we were able to gauge a couple things. Well, if you lived on campus, you often dated, and this is not super statistically significant because our sample size is small, but you very much often dated somebody who lived in your dorm or lived in the dorm across the hall. There's just so many of you. Apparently, it was not super likely for you to cross all the way across campus. You have a number of people who are dating right next door to each other. This is also the area where a number of students live and non-students live here as well. And we saw that there was a lot of dating going on here. And when we asked students qualitatively, you know, what helps your relationship? What about State College, Pennsylvania, where Penn State is, helps your relationship? They said it was very easy to walk around at night. They felt safe going home late at night on their own, and the street lights helped them do that. So it was interesting to see how the built environment and the configuration and the safety of the built environment allowed people from different couples to travel home safely at night in this area. So this is an urban planning kind of project that is one of the first ones to take a look at romance in the built environment. And a lot of people said that their most romantic times were together in nature. So we recommended some more hiking areas. It's easy to believe. All right, so those are some of my favorite papers and some motivating background about how geographic space and interpersonal relationships in a social network can interact. I'll now go over a couple of new research examples. They're mostly descriptive in nature, but we have the example of the Mafia, and then I'll show you a brief example with the food sharing network. So the first example is a rather descriptive case study from the 1960s data on mafia networks in New York. I collaborated with it on this paper with sociologist Dan Della Posa, who is a specialist on mafia. So what Dan did is he went through these dossiers, paper dossiers that were collected in the 1960s by what's the modern day drug enforcement agency, the modern day DEA. It was the Federal Narcotics Bureau, and this was for a Senate investigation. So he went through the different dossiers and he extracted information about social networks. So this is Big Frank. They have his birthday, his height, some of his descriptive features, and then they also have the localities where he frequented. So he resides at this address here, and again, this was in the early 60s. And so we have a geographic location for all of these individuals. We also had some locations where they frequented. This is called the Cuckoo Club, the Hulu Hut, and the Java Club in San Diego. To the best of our knowledge, those are not there anymore. So that part of their activity space we were not able to capture. We have a little bit of kinship background here. And then this part is also very important, is the criminal associates. So we are able to construct, Dan was able to construct a social network based on the known associates between individuals. And so we have an address, and then we have the social network between them. So we have the edges as known associates. And again, this is archival data. New York City, it's for the whole US, but New York City had a big concentration here of almost 300 nodes. And between these nodes, there's 936 edges. So what does this network look like just as a sociogram? So Dan made this using GetFi, which we highly recommend as a very cool network visualization software. So each individual here is a node. The size of the node means that they have more connections or higher degree. So the total network has 680 members, and it includes about 2,699 edges between these members. So the average degree, so the average number of friends someone has, we call them friends as a clinical term, is about 7, and it ranged from 1 to 77. And John Armento had the most, 77. The average path length, so that's like your 6 degrees of separation hops between people, it was 3.88. So that's how removed people were from each other. And one thing that's really important in driving this network is the concept of family. So what family do you work for? Do you work for the Profaci family? Do you work for the Bonanno family? Do you work for the St. Louis family? Many of the families were named for the city that they were in. And so color here indicates family. So you can see just by visualizing this, how the families drive a lot of the ties within this network. This kind of big agglomeration here, these are the New York City Big 5 families. And that included the Genovese family with 149 members, the Lucchese family with 124, the Gambino family with 67, and the Profaci family with 25 members. And these organizations comprise about 46% of the network. So here's what the network looks like in geographic space. And I have a lot of maps of this one here. And so we have the nodes. These different nodes are the locations of the individuals, and the edges between them are their association. So when you see a orange tie, it means it's the same family tie. And we were able to find out that a lot of these families sent someone to go live in Miami. And Miami was a family-less area, and they all kind of hung out on South Beach here in Miami. And it was a really important place for gambling and the import of drugs and cigars, among other things. And so everyone sent a representative down there to say, hey, you're going to go to Miami and make money for the family. This isn't, I made this map, so I say it's not that map. But a lot of ties here between Detroit and New York were present, and there was a number of intermarriages. Some of the bosses from New York, they sent, I don't know the verb there, their daughters married bosses from Detroit, and that helped that coordination. This guy out here, this is Joe Bonanno, aka Joey Bananas, and he was exiled from his family. Next slide. Okay, drug connections, an empirical puzzle. So this is the actual network that was created from a 1963 Senate committee report on the interstate drug trade. And it's showing a well-connected network of narcotics distribution. So our network that we use is not the same as this network, but a lot of the patterns that we were seeing in our network are also present here. We do see a number of people in Miami, and we do see a lot of trade and connection between the big cities here. This network is a bit top-down. It shows that there's a lot of coordination, and then there's a decent logistical ability to move drugs between places. If we were just seeing very, very localized regional ties, we would know that that drug trade was not as efficient. So as mentioned, families drive this network. So one of our questions, research questions here was, are families tight-knit socially, geographically, or both? And this is just a very brief kind of overall description. Because a lot of the analysis methods we use here are descriptive in nature. So each of these dots represents one family. The bigger ones here are the Genovese family, the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, and these are the New York families. So we used ArcMap, we computed the standard distance between all the members. So if you're high here, it means that your family is really, really spread out. If you're low, it means that your family is very, very close by and all the members can kind of see each other. This is network density. So network density means that if all your members are connected to each other, you have a clique. And if all your members are not connected to each other, if you have very few connections interspersed, it means you're very, very sparse network. So we would expect that if you have a sparse network, you're a bit dispersed. And if you have a clique-like network, you're a bit clustered. And we can see that trend going down a bit here. We do see that there's some anomalies. New England, because it's not one city, it's kind of across New England, that one had a higher standard distance that given its network density. But these people stayed together despite being dispersed. Another interesting example is this Appoaches family. If y'all are so close to each other, why aren't you very well connected? I'm not sure what the answer is there, but we'll see what it looks like on the next map. This relationship follows a power law fit with our R-squared of 0.83, if anybody is interested in that. So here's what the Appoaches family looks like. This is in the south part of Brooklyn here. This is an area called Dyker Heights. So we have Giuseppe Appoaches. He is the boss. He's the leader here. And this is an example of the agents that he was connected to nearby, and 1 kilometer in blue and another one in orange. I heard you guys like these colors. Yeah. Okay. These are all the connections that are nearby. So a lot of people were connected to their boss, but they weren't interconnected to each other. Here's another example where we do have more higher connections. This is an example of the St. Louis family. All family members were right around St. Louis. This is just the median value of all of them. And we can see that there are connections that sort of form a little bit of a ring and go across the park, but there are some people that even though they all lived in St. Louis, they didn't know each other or they weren't in the data set. So our next research question here was, do powerful members live near the geographic center of their families? And this is a pretty easy GIS question to answer because we can just take the centroid of the family where they live and we just calculate the distance from that center and whether more higher degree family members live there. This is a little bit of a confetti diagram. The colors actually don't mean anything here. But what this is showing is that people who live far away, so the distance to the family median center, as that got higher, so you're farther away, and then here we have the degree. And here is John Armento again. He is our 77 person with 77 friends. And he lived in New York very, very close to his family. So he was able to keep eyes on things. In fact, a number of the higher degree people tended to live very, very close to their family. Michael Coppola of the Genovese family, he's a high degree member, but they sent him to Miami. Here are the other Miami-based agents here. Here are the people across this degree that got sent to Miami. Here's our friend Joe Bonanno, who was exiled to Tucson. And these are some Genovese family members that are in California. Here's what some of these people look like. So here are some of their photos, and then this is where they lived in New York City. Giuseppe Perfaci, again, is by the water. We have some people over here who kind of lived around the docks, perhaps for importing and exporting. Again, our collaborator is an expert on this topic, so he was the one who was able to better understand this. And then we have a number of people who are living in the kind of more suburban area, and then we have some that are kind of scattered around. And these are the highest members of the network. We did regression analysis to see if they tended to live in higher or lower density, higher income areas, et cetera. And even though we were using data from the 1960s for that, nothing panned out. So we didn't get to see if there was any sort of GIS statistical correlation. So we have a more analytical research question that we're using some more advanced GIS methods to use. And the question is, where are connected clusters located? So this is a map of the New York family. And then, and when we see a little red connection here, it means that they're connections that are very close. And the reason why we want to capture close connections here is they can walk to see each other and perhaps meet and not have to talk on the phone. And it can be a little bit more covert. So we want to use some scan methods, like our moving window, to detect clusters of connections. And in most GIS methods, when we are trying to detect clusters, we just detect clusters of points, like where the points are. And that's our basic like point pattern analysis to say, oh, there's a cluster of points here, there's a cluster of points here, maybe there's a cluster of points here. We only want to focus on connected points. So we have some very basic scan statistics that we're currently experimenting with now. One is called edge scan, and the other one is called node density scan. And we've implemented this in R. They'll take in an edge list and a node list. And for each node in the spatial social network, it calculates focal statistics. So that's like your moving window that roves around. So we have a focal window where we have a focal node, and then we have a Manhattan distance and a Euclidean distance and a k-nearest neighbors, just because we want to do a sensitivity test. You have to use Manhattan distance when you're doing something in Manhattan. We recently responded to a very well-founded comment that we should be using travel time. We had shied away from that a little bit because we were like, well, we don't know what the roads looked like in 1960, but they do tend to look quite similar to the roads today. So we just implemented travel time very recently. So normally in our focal statistics, we would kind of calculate the number of nodes. With edge scan, it's very simple. We just calculate the number of edges between there. It's a very simple, quick computation. And then for network density scan, we calculate the number of edges that are present divided by the number of possible edges. So we say, hey, did you get a click there or not? And so we wanted to implement these in a couple of different ways and find out whether they were viable. I'm going to go over this next slide kind of fast, a little bit. But I did want to let you know that we were doing a sensitivity test here. So we do Euclidean distance at many different scales or many different neighborhood size. We do Manhattan distance at neighborhood size, and then we do the k-nearest neighbors at different sizes as well. The k-nearest neighbors didn't work out so well for us because of the water. You had people picking up people in Staten Island. You had people picking up people where there weren't bridges, and so that one didn't work out when you had a lot of water for the k-nearest neighbors. So when we are able to find the mean and standard deviation for our edge scan, like for example, how many edges on average does the average kind of one kilometer Euclidean circle have? About 5 edges on average. What is the average density? It's about 0.1, so that's how well is that connected. How many nodes are greater than 0? This was just a kind of a sanity check for us. If we're using Manhattan distance, we have a value of about 4. So Manhattan distance 1 kilometer, if you took a random place on our area, it would be about 4 edges, and then the network would be connected at this type of these type of numbers. So we have about 0.01 for our connectivity. Again, when we use the KNN, it's very generous and it makes it more connected. It tends to overestimate it. So let me show you where these are. So here's an example of the edge scan statistics, and here's an example of the network density scan statistics. For this one, this is not the result of a sensitivity test because it's just one example, but this is using Euclidean distance at 1 kilometer. And so we were able to find that we had some statistically significant areas here where they're dark using our scan statistics. But when we were looking at, and I'll show you this on the next slide, and then this one is network density, and these were the areas that we found were statistically significant as well. Here's where the Appoaches family lives. This area here is Little Italy that you may have heard of. This is East Harlem. G over here is Flushing, and A is East Bronx. But compared with a more traditional method, like the Geddes or GI star statistics, if we just were using those and we wanted to find out whether the points formed hotspots or not with a different confidence interval, they wouldn't have picked up these areas. So these areas wouldn't have been picked up based on the density of points alone. So some of them were picked up at different confidence intervals. So 99% confidence, we did have something like Little Italy here, and then we did also have East Harlem. So those were coordinated and say they're both very important in the more traditional metrics and in our metrics. But if we were looking at little clusters of where we wanted to see connections between people, these methods, the traditional dot density scan methods, they're not as applicable when you're looking at whether interpersonal relationships are close by. So this is not a particularly advanced method, but it served our purpose of trying to find areas where there were higher or lower sets of connections. So that's what I have on the Mafia. And next, I'll show you a little bit more about our next case study. So this is a sneak peek, meaning that it's still in progress. There's a food network sharing network in southwestern Virginia. It's always good to have a context map. That's why it's sneak peek. Put that in later. So Blacksburg is where Virginia Tech is, large like university. And these nodes here are organizations, and the links between them are whether they share food with each other, like pantry food. Here are some examples. This specific case study came from Jamie Edwards. She's now Jamie Kelly, and her dissertation was entitled Over the River and Through the Woods, Examining the Relationship Between Network Structure, Collaboration, and Geography. And she studies organization science, and we found her dissertation, and we said, hey, UF Geography, let's take a look at let's do some more mapping with it. We took a subset of this network that has 41 nodes and 50 edges. And the subset is based on sharing pantry food and sharing perishable goods with each other. So this is what the network looks like in geographic space here. So we have these different nodes, and some of the examples for them is Feeding America. This is Feeding America is a very large food sharing organization. Other ones are called Beans and Rice. So that's an organization that's in a couple of these towns. Here's Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech is. They have the Virginia Tech Campus Kitchen. They have shelters. They have the farmers market, refugee organizations. They have food banks. And these are ones that coordinate food with each other. And we want to maximize relationships and sharing among this network and minimize travel time, because the food is very heavy, but we also want to maintain the trusted relationships. So one of Jamie's questions for us was, where are people being sort of efficient and where are people being a little bit less efficient? So we developed a very basic metric called K-fulfillment to answer this question. K-fulfillment is, I know you have 6 neighbors. Are they your 6 closest neighbors? Are your 6 closest neighbors, are you connected to all of them? And so when you see darker values here, it means that yes, this is very sensitive to the number of pies you have. We found out that these two were, even though they're a bit of an anomaly because they don't have many ties, they were very localized in their connections. We found out that people here up in Perrysburg, they were also very localized with their connections. And then we also used something called the local flattening ratio, which I'm happy to explain offline for her, which is the local flattening ratio is given the total distance that you're currently connecting with, and given the most efficient distance that you could use, what's the ratio between those two? And we are able to see that these correlated with each other some points and some points not, but we were able to see that, again, the ones in Perrysburg were very efficient in their coordination. And so she said, yes, there's actually a priest up there who went door to door and went to these organizations and made the connections and facilitated them because they didn't want to, or they weren't traveling into the city as much. So this we viewed as something interesting because we were able to see that when we use some of these very basic metrics, these little ratios, we were able to elicit a story and what was going on there. We also showed with some basic statistics that if you were close to the median or mean center of the network, you weren't higher ties or more important powerful nodes based on centrality degree. Just because they were closer didn't mean they were more powerful. That was a hypothesis we had. We also did something with points of interest here, POIs. If you were around more POIs, were you a higher degree node? No, that one didn't pan out statistically either. And so I'll show you one last thing on this network, and then I'll move on to what we're going to do to try to create some community around this topic. So one of our questions was, where should new connections be made? So we made a metric called missed connections. Has anyone ever been on Craigslist? Yeah, they used to have something called missed connections there. And we are using the same term here because we thought it just kind of, when we were talking about it, just kind of split out. The route factor is a much older metric from the 1970s, and that is showing based on what the network distance is based on the Euclidean distance. So the ratio of the network distance and the Euclidean distance. So we wanted to say, hey, can we detect two places that are nearby each other but don't have any friends in common or don't have many friends in common? So these 6 degrees of separation, but they're really, really close to each other. We thought that those would be some strategic ties to make in this network to make it a little bit more efficient. So here are some examples. We have our log of distance here between each pair of points in our network, and then over here are the network hops, so the degrees of separation to get from each other. And then we found out that for this example, in an elementary school in the farmers market, which are here's the Blacksburg Farmers Market, and here's the elementary school. They didn't have connections in common. They were separated by 6 degrees. So they weren't even affiliated with the same number of people. And so one example, because our author here is a policy person and she knows these individuals quite well, was to say, hey, you could potentially make a connection at this place. And so they would know each other and be a little bit more connected in the network. So that might be a strategic connection. And then we had a couple of other strategic connections, a mission and a New River Action Network. And then we have a refugee partnership and the farmers market as well. The farmers market actually showed up as being disconnected from a number of areas that were right around them. So one policy implication here is you might want to go to the farmers market and say, hey, there's places nearby that could use your extra food at the end of the farmers market and distribute them. So thank you very much. Right now, I will give a little bit of a discussion, about 5 minutes, on how we're creating community based on some of this work. Our project is called Snowman, and the social network mapping nexus. And here's our Snowman. And so we have, it's going to launch at the end of the month here. I notice he's a little bit grainy. We'll work on that. Okay, so here's the Snowman website. So the mapping networks is part of our project to develop an integrated research educational framework for the spatial social network analysis. And so what we want to do here is bring together faculty, graduate students, researchers, practitioners who have a spatial social network, are collecting spatial social network case studies, and want to use GIS and interactive tools to analyze them. We begin with like what is a spatial social network and share a little bit of like an encyclopedia article about what they are and give examples of current spatial social network literature that we've found. We also have a wide lit review of the spatial social, this goes on and on and on. Spatial social network examples we have broken them down into things like number of nodes, number of edges, geolocation, et cetera, so people who are interested in this topic can go find literature. We are also, our next phase is to contact some of these authors and talk to them a little bit about their data sharing and whether they're able to subset their network share it, anonymize their network share it, et cetera. So people who want to do statistical analyses on already published work might be able to do that. We have an art tool that we're making. It's already up here on our website. And it's mostly based on visualization right now. So if you want to visualize spatial social networks, how to do that, at the end is where we're adding our new descriptive metrics. We also have very exciting software, the Snowman software, that we are building every day with PhD students, teach engine, working very, very hard on this software. I'll show you a screen cap of it. It is online software where you can load in your spatial network. This is a network of flights and global flights, and the colors are based on just communities you can use community detection or modularity here. And these communities just found from the network, when you put them on the map, they tend to be geographically coordinated, which is not a big surprise since flights tend to go between places. So we have a way that you can interact with it. You can zoom, you can link, you can select different things. You can see the different distances between edges. You can see the different degrees of the nodes, how many friends they have. And then you can make scatter plots with different metrics here. And here's the Mafia network. When we are looking at this network here, we can put convex holes on here to see how far something's spread. This is the same thing we saw with the different families. And so when we get the different families here, we can change the colors of the map based on these different families. And then this is us experimenting with the food sharing network too, finding out that Feeding America over here, even though it has so many ties, it's pretty far removed from the network. And then this is, again, the route factor showing that these two places are very, very close by. But if you wanted to see them connected in the network, it's a lot of different connections. All right, we're having a workshop. If you're interested in this topic, we have some fellowships for students to attend. It's going to be Thursday and Friday in Atlanta if you want to work on some spatial social network stuff with us. We are very thrilled to be representing geographers in this the social network conference. So delving into some of those communities that maybe you have also delved into before. We're going to be doing a workshop in Portland on GIS mapping for social networks. And if you'd like to join our Google group and get some updates about this work, we'd love to have you. So in all, I just want to say that, you know, small social networks have geographies, and we want to work with a lot of different disciplines. We need specialized methods, and tools to support the exploration of these networks. Everything you saw here today is very exploratory. It needs a lot of different networks to show that it's useful. And a lot of the descriptions that we use, data descriptions we use today are quite simple. We use a lot of ratios. Yes. And the project is in motion, so please check back with us if you're interested in spatial social networks. Right, thank you. Thank you to my collaborators. We have a lot.
I enjoyed the talk very much. I think it's a topic that's really taking off again. There was interest in the 70s, and so all of us should benefit. I had a question on the New York network. The diameter network was approximately 3.84. Is it possible to take some of these networks, put them into a connectivity structure, and then power the connectivity structure of matrix up to the diameter of the network, and then read across the connectivity matrix some across the rows to get a weighted value for each of the nodes? If you did that and took the weighted values and put them back into the map and then used the Gettys G statistic, you would probably, your clusters would probably pan out. That's just, I'm speculating here, but I would think that might work. I think the reason the get is G certificate, because each node is basically unweighted, they're the same. So if you weight the nodes by the degree to which each node is interconnected in the entire network, taking it up to the network diameter, then one could probably see those clusters popping out. That would just be a recommendation, because I really have a lot of faith in the get G statistic to find clusters, and I think that might be a way to do that with the network, because if you use the weighted node as opposed to the unweighted nodes, that might this is a suggestion to try. So.
No, I think that making the degree, if you're a popular node, you should be treated differently than an unpopular node.
Absolutely.
I agree. Thank you for that. It's a great idea.
This is just a small question, but building on that, can you see what the data source was for the prime families example? I just wasn't sure.
The data source, yeah, absolutely. So the data source, this is where I scroll back through everything, right? So the data source for the crime families is based on some dossiers from the 1960s. They're right here. And so the edges are the people that were done as criminal associates. And I will say that the vast majority of these were either born in Italy or of Italian descent. And there was one woman in
This dossier information. You have a criminal history here.
it.
Can you tell if there are any nodes that are sort of protected, right? So if you have these individuals who have never been arrested, this guy only was arrested for a traffic violation. Do they sort of protect themselves from having any contact or criminal association with somebody that has a known criminal record?
Well, that's a very interesting question. That would be a really good thing to include in like a little bit of a block model. Yeah, I like that. That's a very good idea. Some of these people, we don't know how complete this is, but if it just looks like this and they have only one arrest record, then it might be possible that that's part of their story and part of the story of their connection.
I would assume that like the crime lords, whatever they're called, the mafia bosses would be more protected and sort of have that in between node before they get to someone with a high level of criminal record.
That's absolutely in line with what I know about this, is that they have these capos that are like kind of foot soldiers who they send to Miami. And so they are. So I think that would be a really nice thing to have space on this. And we do, since Dan did digitize all this and make the attributes, that's a great idea.
So thanks for the presentation.
Yes.
It's really interesting. So all the examples you gave are like snapshots in time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a general question, but like, how do you deal with the fact that networks change over time? Or what kind of methods are there out there for that?
That is something I was asked that today already. That is true. That is very true. We've been mostly working on remedying a geographic space and the connections. So that's the part that we've been focusing on now. But the temporal element is crucial. You need to know how that changes. And so we don't have an answer for that in terms of our metrics at the moment. So we would like to work with you to look at how things evolve, especially in terms of, we know that networks have this concept called preferential attachment, where if you're adding more nodes, you're more likely to add on to higher degree nodes. What does that look like in space? I don't know. If you have that system where you're adding more nodes, are they going to be near like close distance nodes? Are you adding far nodes? Is it a mixture? That question is fascinating. And a lot of these temporal questions are definitely the next thing that we have to do. Thank you. That's a very good.
I just had a comment about that. If you're adding more nodes in the system, there's the mathematical, there's an efficient way of doing that. In theory, it's called the Steiner nodes, Steiner points. You might want to.
I brought out my notebook.
Steiner, that's something to take a look at it, because it improves the efficiency of the network. It's where the node, a new node is more likely to appear. So Steiner points. Just a suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you. That's one thing that's interesting about wondering about how to coordinate these networks. Do you just use the existing nodes and then there's new connection, or does a new node pop up too? And you have to connect those new nodes. They're both different situations.
So I'm interested in a completely different question. So we work in conservation, and what we're finding is that misinformation and disinformation comes from relatively few people. Is any people applying this to find out who's spreading, influencing, and it must apply to politics as well? Where does the misinformation and disinformation come from, et cetera, et cetera? Is anyone applying the sort of network theory to those questions?
I don't know. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, many people do, but without looking at space. I think this is where Dr. Angus' research is so interesting. She's at the forefront of research. She brings the social and the spatial together. And so it's still an open question because beyond the GIS question, there's also the question of how to conceptualize space and society. So the link that we create between the two.
It's very important, yeah. And I agree. I don't know of anybody who's studying that spatially, but whether it gets disseminated far away or whether it stays locally is a really interesting question.
And also politicians are getting legit information or not legit, they're getting from one or two sources or multiple sources.
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't come across that research in the spatial realm yet. Very important.
All right, let me check if there are any questions online. So I hope it's worth it for the 5 hours drive. You got a lot of very interesting questions. I don't see any question. Yeah. All right, so I learned a lot. Thank you. Very, very illuminating talk. I think you are now convinced that networks can be very interesting. So consider taking Spatial Network class, all right? This is a great advertisement for my class. Thank you.